Northern Vermont, January 1972. When mathematics teacher David Brennan constructed a 30-foot geodesic dome on his hillside property instead of a conventional ranch house, every contractor in Addison County called it a fool's errand. The triangulated structure, inspired by Buckminster Fuller's radical designs, wasn't meant for New England winters. It was meant for exhibitions, for temporary installations, for anything but standing against sub-zero temperatures and 60 miles per hour winds tearing down from the Canadian border. But Brennan wasn't building a statement or an experiment. He was building the most thermally efficient structure the Green Mountains had ever seen. And when the winter of 72 to 73 arrived with temperatures that collapsed heating systems across 3 counties, that peculiar geometric shell would demonstrate a heating principle that conventional architecture had completely overlooked. What did this Vermont educator understand about heat retention that every licensed architect in the state had dismissed? If you want to learn one alternative building technique every week that actually worked when fuel prices skyrocketed, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because the story proves that the most efficient solutions often hide in plain geometry. David Brennan wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old mathematics teacher at Middlebury Union High School who'd taken his Navy discharge savings and moved his family to Vermont for a simpler life. The farmhouse they rented that first winter of 1971 was solid by local standards. 2-story colonial, clapboard siding, a oil furnace that rumbled in the basement like a diesel engine. By New England standards, it was respectable. But respectability doesn't keep you warm at 1,200 feet elevation when Arctic air comes pouring down through the Champlain Valley. His first Vermont winter taught him the brutal truth. A tight house is a myth. Cold seeped through walls like they were cheesecloth. The furnace ran 18 hours a day and the house never broke 60 degrees. His children, Michael age 12, Sarah age 9, and Thomas age 6, slept in winter coats under 3 blankets. His wife Ellen stuffed rolled towels along the baseboards every evening, only to find them stiff with frost by morning. The living room stayed around 58 degrees on good days. The bedrooms hovered in the low 50s. They burned oil like the furnace was feeding a bonfire. The problem wasn't the construction. The landlord had insulated the attic the previous fall. The windows were double-hung and relatively tight. The problem was physics. Cold doesn't just chill air. It radiates through walls, pulls heat straight out of a structure through conduction and convection working together like a hydraulic press. And in the Green Mountains, positioned to catch every weather system rolling down from Canada, the cold never stopped. February 1972 hit with temperatures that made the previous months feel like practice rounds. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read -18 degrees at breakfast. The oil furnace ran continuously. The house temperature climbed to 58 by noon and stayed there, shivering. Then the heating bill arrived. David opened the envelope at the kitchen table while Ellen made dinner. $287. His monthly teaching salary was $625. Nearly half his income for 1 month of inadequate heat. He stared at the number until the digits blurred. Ellen saw his face and knew before he showed her. That night, after the children were asleep and Ellen had gone to bed, David sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and pencil. The house creaked around him. The furnace kicked on again, its rumble a reminder of money burning in the basement. He started calculating. A rectangular house, roughly 28 by 40 feet, 2 stories. Exterior wall surface area including roof, approximately 3,840 square feet. Every single square foot a pathway for heat to escape. He drew a circle. A dome, 30 feet in diameter, same interior square footage, roughly 1,200 square feet of living space. He calculated the surface area of a hemisphere, 2,827 square feet. He checked the math twice. A dome had 26% less exterior surface than a rectangular house of equivalent volume. Less surface meant less area bleeding heat into the Vermont night. The difference wasn't trivial. It was enormous. He sat back, pencil still in his hand, and understood something that every builder in Addison County had somehow missed. Shape wasn't just aesthetics. Shape was thermal efficiency. A sphere was nature's solution to the surface area problem. Bubbles formed spheres because that shape enclosed maximum volume with minimum surface. Cells, eggs, planets. The mathematics had been proven for 500 million years. He just had to build it. Ellen found him still at the table at 2 a.m., surrounded by calculations. "David, come to bed. You're freezing." He looked up at her, and she saw something in his face that made her pause. "We're building a dome," he said. She blinked. "A what?" "A geodesic dome. Buckminster Fuller's design. Triangulated panels forming a hemisphere. Same square footage as a conventional house, but 30% less exterior surface. Less surface, less heat loss. We could heat it with a fraction of what we're burning now." His words came faster, hands moving to sketch the shape in the air. Ellen pulled her robe tighter. The kitchen was 52 degrees. "David, we have 3 children and $8,000 in savings. That's supposed to be for a down payment on a real house." Her voice was careful, measured. The voice she used when she was trying very hard not to say what she was thinking. "This would be a real house. More real than this." He gestured at the cold walls around them. "Ellen, I've done the mathematics. A dome reduces heat loss by physics, not by adding more insulation or burning more fuel. The geometry does the work. It's elegant. It's efficient. It's what we should have been building all along." She looked at the calculations spread across the table, numbers and angles she couldn't follow. She looked at her husband, exhausted and freezing, hands still moving as he explained thermodynamics at 2 a.m. "Have you ever built anything bigger than a bookshelf?" she asked quietly. "I was a Navy engineer for 6 years. I understand structure and stress loads. I can follow plans. And Fuller's designs are proven. There are domes all over the country." He didn't mention that most of those domes were experimental, temporary, or in mild climates. He didn't mention that he'd never seen one in Vermont. Ellen was silent for a long moment. Upstairs, one of the children coughed in their sleep. The furnace rumbled on again. "How much would it cost?" she asked finally. "Materials, maybe $4,000. I'd do the labor myself. And land. 3, maybe 4,000 for a few acres." She did the math quickly. Their entire savings. Everything they'd built since David left the Navy. The college fund they'd started. The safety net. All of it. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked. "What if we build this thing and it's just as cold or worse? What if the shape doesn't matter and we've spent everything on a science experiment?" David met her eyes. "Mathematics don't lie, Ellen. A sphere is the most efficient shape in the universe. We're not inventing anything. We're copying nature. It has to work." She heard the certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that came from numbers and theory. She also heard something else. Desperation. Fear. The weight of watching his children sleep in winter coats. "Trust me," he said quietly. Ellen looked at the calculations one more time, at her husband's bleeding fingertips from grading papers in the cold, at the frost forming on the inside of the kitchen window. She thought about her children sleeping upstairs in 50-degree bedrooms. She thought about $287 heating bills that would only get worse. "Show me the plans," she said. And David Brennan smiled for the first time in 3 months, because his wife had just agreed to bet everything they had on a shape. If you're still here, please like the video and subscribe. That's how you can support us for now. Thank you as you do. Spring came late to Vermont in 1972. But when it arrived, David Brennan was ready. He'd spent March studying Fuller's geodesic calculations, measuring angles to the 10th of a degree, ordering materials from suppliers who thought he was building a greenhouse. In April, he bought 3 acres on a south-facing hillside 8 miles outside Middlebury for $3,200. The land had good drainage, decent sun exposure, and most importantly, it was his. The materials order came to $4,100. Plywood sheets, 2x4s for the frame, roofing panels, insulation, fasteners, sealant. Nearly everything they had left. Ellen signed the check with a hand that only shook slightly. Their savings account, built over 6 years of careful living, now held $700. The college fund was gone. The safety net was gone. They were committed. The design was a 3-frequency icosahedron, 30 feet in diameter. 185 triangular panels, each cut to precise angles, assembled into a structure that would look like something between a golf ball and a spaceship. David spent his evenings after teaching calculating strut lengths, checking load distributions, sketching connection details. He'd wake at 5 a.m. to review the math before school started. The building inspector came in late April, a week after David had poured the foundation ring. Frank Morrison was a practical man who'd been approving construction in Addison County for 22 years. He walked around the circular concrete pad twice, looked at David's blueprints, and shook his head. "I can't approve what isn't in the code book," he said flatly. "Show me where geodesic residential structures are addressed in Vermont building codes." David knew the answer. They weren't. The structure meets all load requirements. The mathematics are sound. Fuller's domes have been proven across the country. Morrison folded the blueprints and handed them back. "Show me 3 successful dome homes in Vermont." "Show me 1. There weren't any." Morrison left without signing the permit. The bank was worse. Richard Thorne, the mortgage officer who'd been friendly when they were looking at conventional houses, turned cold when David explained the dome design. "We don't finance experimental architecture. This isn't a proven dwelling type. Show me comparable sales. Show me appraisal standards. Show me anything that tells me this property will hold value." David couldn't. Thorne denied the mortgage application before David finished talking. The solution came at 12% interest from a personal loan company in Burlington. David would be paying off his future salary for the next 5 years, but they could start building. Ellen didn't ask about the interest rate. She'd stopped asking questions that had answers she didn't want to hear. Construction started the first week of May. David set up a table saw in the rented farmhouse garage and began cutting triangular panels. Each piece had to be exact. A 3-frequency icosahedron required precision, angles measured to fractions of a degree, sides matching within 1/8 of an inch. 185 panels. He cut them in the evenings after teaching, hands growing raw from pushing plywood through the saw, sawdust coating everything. Ellen helped measure and mark, holding panels while David cut, checking dimensions against his calculations. The children played in the growing piles of sawdust, building forts from scrap lumber, not understanding that their future was being cut one triangle at a time. Michael, old enough to sense the tension, asked once if they were really going to live in the strange building. David said yes. Michael didn't ask again. Calvin Mercer stopped by in early May, driving slow past the construction site, then parking and walking over. Mercer ran the biggest contracting business in the county, built half the homes on the hillside. He looked at the foundation ring, at the pile of triangular panels, at David's drawings. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen," he said conversationally. "A sphere won't shed snow. Snow'll pile up, collapse the whole thing. And those joints, every single one's going to leak. You'll be heating the outdoors." David explained the mathematics. Surface area to volume ratio, thermal efficiency, the geometric principles that made domes superior. Mercer listened with the expression of a man watching someone explain why gravity doesn't apply to them. "Math's fine on paper," he said. "Your kid's going to freeze in that thing because you trusted a calculator?" He walked back to his truck shaking his head. But the physics didn't care about Mercer's skepticism. Volume increases as the cube of radius. Surface area increases as the square. That relationship, immutable as gravity, meant that spherical structures enclosed more space with less exterior surface than any other shape. A dome with 1,200 square feet of interior space had 2,827 square feet of exterior surface. An equivalent rectangular house had 3,840 square feet. That difference, 1,013 square feet, was 1,013 fewer square feet bleeding heat into Vermont winters. Every square foot of wall conducts thermal energy outward. Every square foot of roof radiates heat into the night sky. Fewer square feet meant less heat loss, period. The mathematics were as certain as multiplication. David knew this. He had to trust it because he'd bet everything on it. The structure rose through May and June. David worked weekends and evenings, Ellen beside him, both of them learning construction through trial and error. Triangular panels connected to form pentagons and hexagons, the pattern emerging like a crystalline growth. Neighbors drove by slowly, some stopping to stare, all of them shaking their heads. The geometry looked wrong against the Vermont hillside, too angular, too deliberate, like something that had landed rather than been built. By late June, the frame was complete, a skeletal hemisphere of wood and ambition. David started installing the roofing panels, working from a ladder that seemed inadequate for the task. His hands bled from splinters and rough lumber. He was 38 years old, had never built anything larger than bookshelves, and was constructing a 30-foot experimental structure his family would live in. One evening in late June, the dome half covered, Ellen stood beside him as the sun set. The structure cast a strange shadow, curved and geometric. "David," she said quietly, "what if they're right? What if this doesn't work?" He was exhausted, covered in sawdust, hands wrapped in bandages. He looked at the dome, at the mathematics made physical. "A honeycomb is hexagons because it's the most efficient shape for bees to build," he said. "A bubble is a sphere because it's the minimum surface for maximum volume. Planets are spheres. Cells are spheres. Nature's been optimizing geometry for 500 million years. We're just copying what already works." "Nature doesn't have building inspectors," Ellen said. David smiled, tired. "Nature has winter. That's a harder test." And he climbed back up the ladder to install another panel, because the only way forward was to finish what they'd started, and trust that mathematics didn't lie. The Brennan family moved into the dome on October 15, 1972. The structure was 75% complete. Interior walls unfinished, insulation exposed in places, the bathroom still waiting for fixtures. But it was theirs, and the lease on the farmhouse had expired. Ellen packed their belongings while David installed the last of the roofing panels, racing against the calendar. They couldn't afford a conventional heating system. The construction had consumed everything, then borrowed against future earnings. No oil furnace, no baseboard heat, no backup system. David installed a single cast iron wood stove in the center of the main living space. $200 at the farm supply store. Their entire heating system sat on a brick pad, black metal, and a chimney pipe rising through the dome's peak. Ellen stood in the empty space that first night, looking at the curved walls, the geometric ceiling, the solitary stove. "We're really doing this," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. David was sealing gaps around a window frame. "It'll work," he said. He'd been saying it for 6 months. Ellen wasn't sure either of them believed it anymore. Building Inspector Frank Morrison showed up the next day. He walked through the dome, noting every unfinished surface, every code violation, every deviation from standard residential construction. "You're living in an incomplete experimental structure with inadequate heating," he said. "I should revoke occupancy right now." David showed him the calculations, the insulation specs, the structural engineering. Morrison left without signing anything, but he didn't shut them down either. "You've got until winter," he said. "If this doesn't work, those kids aren't staying here." The neighbors thought they'd lost their minds. 3 children living in a half-finished sphere heated by a wood stove. The Mercers, living in their conventional ranch 200 yards down the hill, watched with a mix of concern and contempt. Calvin told anyone who'd listen that the Brennans would be back in a rental house by Christmas. Then October brought news that changed everything. The Arab oil embargo hit on October 17th. OPEC nations cut production, targeting countries supporting Israel. Oil supplies tightened overnight. Prices doubled, then tripled. Heating oil in Vermont went from 45 cents per gallon to $1.30, then to $2. Lines formed at fuel distributors. The county implemented rationing, 50 gallons per household per month. Panic spread through the community like ice forming on glass. Conventional homes in Vermont were built for cheap, abundant oil. Post-war construction, minimal insulation, oil furnaces sized to burn through cheap fuel. Suddenly those homes were unsustainable. Families faced a choice: freeze or go broke. Most were heading toward both. November temperatures dropped into the 20s and 30s. The first real test. The Mercer family, living in their 1,400 square foot ranch with conventional oil heat, ran their furnace 14 hours a day. Inside temperature hovered around 65 degrees. They burned through 180 gallons that month. At the new prices, $468. Calvin's monthly salary was $850. More than half gone just for inadequate heat. The Brennan Dome told a different story. David loaded the wood stove twice a day, morning and evening. 6 hours of burning total. The interior temperature held steady at 70 degrees. Cost for a month's firewood, $35. Ellen walked through the space in shirt sleeves, still disbelieving. The children played on the floor in socks. No coats required. The geometry was working exactly as the mathematics predicted. Minimal exterior surface area reduced conductive heat loss. A conventional rectangular house lost heat through every flat wall, every corner, every surface exposed to cold air. The dome's curved shape had no flat surfaces for wind to press against. Air deflected around it, unable to create the pressure differentials that pulled heat from buildings. Inside, the physics were even more elegant. Hot air from the wood stove rose naturally through convection. In a rectangular room, it would pool at the ceiling, wasted. In the dome, it rose to the peak, then circulated down the curved walls in a continuous pattern. The spherical geometry distributed warmth evenly. No cold corners where air settled and died. No long hallways creating temperature gradients. One central heat source serving the entire volume. The skeptics weren't convinced. "Wait till it gets cold," they said. "That's nothing. January will tell the truth." But the doubt in their voices had shifted. Less certainty, more worry. They were watching their own heating bills climb while the dome sat warm on the hillside. December came and temperatures dropped into the teens. Conventional homes across the county struggled. Families wore coats indoors, stuffed blankets against windows, burned through their oil allocations before mid-month. The Mercers kept their thermostat at 62 and still their furnace ran constantly. Oil trucks couldn't keep up with demand. Some families ran out completely, waiting days for ration refills. The dome remained stable at 68 to 72 degrees. David burned slightly more wood as temperatures dropped, maybe 8 hours a day instead of 6. The increase was marginal. The physics didn't change. Less surface area meant less heat loss regardless of outside temperature. The curved walls deflected 40-mile-per-hour winds that hammered conventional homes flat. The spherical interior circulated heat that would have escaped through corners and corridors. Calvin Mercer stopped by on a Saturday in mid-December. He didn't announce himself, just pulled up and walked to the door. David answered, wearing a flannel shirt. No coat. Calvin noticed. "How much would you burning?" he asked without preamble. "About a quarter cord per week," David said. Calvin's jaw tightened. "I'm burning 45 gallons of oil per week. That's $117 at current prices. Every week." David saw the calculation happening behind Calvin's eyes. For weeks per month, nearly $500 just for heat. For a house that barely stayed warm. "I can show you the mathematics," David offered. "How the surface area reduction creates thermal efficiency. How the geometry." "I don't need mathematics." Calvin cut him off. "I need heat." But the contempt was gone from his voice. Now it was just worry, raw fear that he couldn't afford to keep his family warm. He looked past David into the dome, saw Ellen cooking dinner in the warm kitchen, saw the children playing without coats. The single wood stove burning calmly in the center. Calvin shook his head and walked back to his truck, but it was a different kind of head shake. Not mockery, confusion, an admission that something he'd been certain about might be wrong. He drove away slowly, like a man whose world had shifted slightly off its foundation. By late December, the community's response had transformed. People still drove by, but now they slowed down longer. Some stopped to ask questions. How much wood are you burning? What's it cost? How warm is it really? The mockery had died, replaced by desperate curiosity. Their own homes were bleeding money and heat, and that strange dome on the hillside was warm. David answered their questions patiently, but he knew words wouldn't convince them. Mathematics wouldn't convince them. Only winter would tell the truth, and winter was just getting started. If you are yet to subscribe, please do to support us on this journey. The forecast came on January 15th. National Weather Service issued an extreme cold warning for all of Vermont. Historic cold snap approaching. 7 days of temperatures between -10 and -30 degrees Fahrenheit. High winds sustained at 40 to 60 miles per hour. The radio announcer's voice carried an edge David had never heard before. Emergency shelters opening in town. Residents advised to prepare for extended extreme conditions. The community mobilized with the urgency of people who'd already been struggling. Fuel oil dealers were overwhelmed within hours. Phone lines jammed with orders. Trucks couldn't deliver fast enough. Prices spiked again, hitting $2.60 per gallon, 6 times the normal rate. Families who'd been rationing carefully throughout their budgets and stockpiled everything they could afford. Schools announced potential closures. The town manager went on local radio asking people to check on elderly neighbors. Calvin Mercer filled his oil tank completely. 275 gallons at $2.60 per gallon. $715. He wrote the check with a hand that shook slightly, knowing it was nearly his entire month's salary, knowing he had no choice. His wife Maria watched the truck pump fuel and did calculations in her head they couldn't afford to finish. January 17th brought the first wave. Temperature dropped to -12 by evening. Wind picked up, sustained at 35 miles per hour, gusting higher. Wind chill hit -42. Across Addison County, conventional homes went into crisis mode. Furnaces ran continuously, oil burning at rates that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Inside temperatures struggled to 60, maybe 65 degrees. Families piled on blankets, wore coats indoors, huddled in living rooms. Pipes began freezing despite the heat. The Hendersons lost their bathroom by midnight. The Morrisons, building inspector Frank's brother's family, wrapped their pipes in heat tape and prayed. Every house on the hillside had smoke pouring from chimneys, furnaces screaming, families burning everything they had just to stay functional. The Brennan Dome told a different story. David loaded the wood stove every 8 hours, 3 times per day, morning, afternoon, evening. Each load, about 3 logs. The interior temperature held at 70 degrees, rock steady. Ellen baked bread in the afternoon, using the oven heat because they had thermal energy to spare. The children played in t-shirts and socks. Thomas, age 6, complained it was too warm and opened a window for 5 minutes before Ellen noticed. January 19th brought the peak. David woke at 6 a.m. to check the thermometer outside. -32 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind howling at 45 miles per hour with higher gusts. Wind chill calculated at -65. The radio was already broadcasting warnings. Stay indoors. Exposed skin will freeze in under 2 minutes. Schools closed countywide. Emergency shelters at capacity. Roads nearly empty except for emergency vehicles. The Mercer house, 200 yards down the hill, was in full crisis. Their furnace had been running 24 hours straight for 2 days. Oil consumption hit 15 gallons per day. Inside temperature in the living room measured 54 degrees. Bedrooms were 48. The bathroom pipes had frozen solid the previous night. The entire family was sleeping in the living room in sleeping bags, layered in every piece of clothing they owned. Calvin sat at the kitchen table that morning doing math he didn't want to finish. They'd burned through 95 gallons since the cold snap started 4 days ago. At $2.60 per gallon, $247 gone. The tank held maybe 180 gallons remaining. At current consumption, 3 days of fuel left. Maybe 4 if they dropped the thermostat to 50 and just tried to keep the pipes from bursting. He looked at his daughter Emma, age 4, sleeping in her winter coat under 3 blankets, and felt something he'd never felt before in his own home. Helplessness. Other neighbors were worse off. The Henderson family evacuated to the town shelter early that morning, unable to keep their house above 45 degrees. The Morrison family's furnace failed completely at 3 a.m., something in the fuel line freezing despite the oil tank being full. Frank Morrison's brother called every repair service in the county. Everyone was backed up 3 days minimum. They loaded their kids in the car and drove to his sister's house in Burlington. The streets were nearly empty by noon. Smoke from chimneys hung in the frozen air, dropping straight down in the brutal cold before the wind caught it. The valley looked like a war zone. Every house bleeding heat and money. Families hunkered down in survival mode. Inside the dome, David loaded the wood stove at 6 a.m., noon, and 8 p.m. 9 logs total for the day. Cost approximately $1.70 in firewood. The interior temperature held at 70 degrees. Sarah, age 9, complained it was too warm and asked if they could turn down the heat. Ellen, cooking dinner in jeans and a sweater, no coat, explained patiently that wood stoves don't have thermostats. The physics were working exactly as predicted. The dome's minimal surface area, 2,827 square feet, compared to a conventional house's 3,840, meant 26% less exterior wall bleeding heat. But the efficiency went beyond simple reduction. The curved walls deflected the brutal 45-mile-per-hour wind that was hammering flat surfaces like a hydraulic press. Wind couldn't create pressure differentials against surfaces it couldn't push against. The air slid around the dome, defeated by geometry. Inside, the spherical shape created perfect thermal circulation. Hot air from the wood stove rose to the dome's peak through natural convection. In a rectangular house, it would pool uselessly at the ceiling. In the dome, it hit the curved surface and rolled down the walls in continuous circulation, distributing warmth evenly throughout the space. No cold corners where air settled and died. No long hallways creating temperature stratification. The geometry eliminated the dead zones that plague conventional construction. Heat loss occurs through conduction, convection, and radiation. The dome attacked all three simultaneously. Minimal surface reduced conductive pathways. Curved walls eliminated convective stripping. The shape itself created an envelope that retained radiant heat. It wasn't magic. It was mathematics made physical, geometry proving what David had calculated a year earlier at a kitchen table while his children shivered. That evening, while families across the county huddled in sleeping bags and watched their fuel gauges drop, while emergency shelters filled beyond capacity and repair trucks couldn't keep up with failures, the Brennan family ate dinner at their table in 70-degree comfort. David used 9 logs. Ellen made pot roast because the oven was reliable. The children did homework without wearing gloves. Outside, -32 degrees and wind that could kill in minutes. Inside, warm enough that Sarah opened a window briefly because her room felt stuffy. The gap between those two realities, measured in fuel costs and human comfort, was 55 degrees of validation. The mathematics had been right all along. The question was whether anyone would live long enough to admit it. The knock came at 11:07 p.m. on January 21st. Unusual. In rural Vermont, neighbors in crisis called first. David was banking the wood stove for the night when he heard it. Firm, urgent, 3 sharp raps. He opened the door to -28 degrees and Calvin Mercer standing on his doorstep carrying his youngest daughter. Emma was 4 years old, wrapped in every blanket the Mercers owned, and still shivering. Behind Calvin stood Maria, his wife, and their 2 sons, ages 8 and 11. All of them bundled in winter coats, hoods pulled tight, scarves wrapped to their eyes. Calvin's voice came out broken, each word costing him something. "Our heat just died. Furnace quit. Can't get a repair guy till morning. Emma's. She's not doing good." Ellen appeared behind David and pulled them inside without a word. The temperature differential hit like a physical force. 70 degrees against -28. The Mercer family, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, stood suddenly in shirt-sleeve comfort. The shock registered visibly on their faces. Maria's hand went to her mouth. The boys looked around like they'd stepped into a different world. Emma stopped shivering within minutes. Ellen took the child from Calvin's arms, unwrapped the frozen blankets, replaced them with dry ones from the linen closet. She carried Emma to the couch near the wood stove and made hot cocoa while the child's color slowly returned from blue-white to pink. Maria Mercer started crying. Relief and shame and gratitude tangled together in sounds she couldn't control. Her sons stripped off their coats, gloves, hats, scarves, down to sweaters, then t-shirts, unable to believe warmth could exist like this in January. Calvin said nothing. He just stood in the center of the dome, hands opening and closing, looking at the curved walls, the single-wood stove, his daughter breathing normally for the first time in hours. This was the man who'd mocked the dome louder than anyone, who'd told David he was risking his family's lives on a science experiment, who'd driven by weekly just to shake his head at the foolishness. Now he stood in the structure he'd called a death trap, holding the fact that his daughter had been hypothermic 20 minutes ago while his own house, conventionally built and inspector-approved, sat at 34 degrees just 200 yards away. The conversation that needed to happen stayed unspoken. There were no words that would make it easier. Calvin had been certain, and certainty had nearly killed his child. David had been right, but saying so would only deepen the wound. So they didn't talk. Ellen made coffee. Maria held Emma and cried quietly. The boys explored the dome with the wonder of children discovering warmth was possible. David added an extra log to the stove, not because it was needed, but because doing something felt better than standing still. Both families slept in the dome that night. Mercer children on couches, parents on the floor with borrowed blankets. David woke at 3 a.m. to check the stove, added one more log, watched the Mercers sleeping in comfort his geometry had created. The temperature never dropped below 68 degrees. Morning came with the thermometer reading -8, a warming trend that felt like spring. The repair truck was already at the Mercer house by 7:30 a.m. Calvin gathered his family, their borrowed blankets, preparing to return home. He stopped at the door. Long silence. David waited. "How much did that stove cost?" Calvin asked. $200, David said. Longer silence. Calvin's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "I spent $600 on oil this month, and my family almost froze." David could have said many things. Could have mentioned the mathematics, the surface area calculations, the geometry he'd tried to explain 6 months ago. He just said, "The shape does most of the work. The stove just helps." Calvin looked back at the dome's interior, the curved walls, the simple black stove still radiating steady warmth. "I need to see your plans." David started to offer to bring them by that afternoon. Calvin cut him off. "No. I need to understand how this works." It was the first time since construction started that Calvin had asked David a question instead of delivering a judgment. David nodded. "Come by tonight. I'll show you everything." Word spreads fast in Vermont communities where everyone knows everyone. 3 more families called that day asking about the dome. How it worked, what it cost, whether the warmth was real. Building Inspector Frank Morrison stopped by on January 24th. "I need to do an inspection," he said. "For the permit." David looked at him carefully. "You threatened to deny occupancy." Frank met his eyes. "I was wrong. Show me how this works." By February, David was fielding questions faster than he could answer them. The high school offered their auditorium for a workshop. David expected maybe 10 or 15 people. 47 showed up, standing room only. Contractors who'd mocked him. Architects who'd dismissed geodesic structures as impractical. Homeowners desperate for solutions. Students taking notes for engineering classes. David explained the mathematics. Surface area to volume ratio. How spheres enclose maximum space with minimum surface. How every square foot of exterior wall is a pathway for heat loss, and the dome had 26% fewer pathways. How curved surfaces deflect wind that would strip heat from flat walls. How spherical geometry creates natural convection currents that distribute warmth evenly. Calvin Mercer sat in the front row taking notes, stopping David occasionally to ask questions, understanding finally what mathematics had been trying to tell him all along. The local newspaper ran a feature in late February. Teacher's dome withstands historic cold. They published comparative data. Conventional 1,400 square foot home, 225 gallons of oil per month, $585. Brennan Dome, 1,200 square feet, 1.5 cords of wood per month, $140. Fuel savings of 76%. Temperature difference during the -32-degree night. Conventional homes at 54 degrees, dome at 70. The article noted that accounting for volume and surface area differences, the effective thermal performance advantage was equivalent to 55 degrees. March brought the first 3 dome construction projects. Spring and summer saw 16 more start. By 1974, geodesic domes were appearing across Vermont. Building codes updated to include geodesic structures as approved residential construction. Banks began approving dome mortgages, convinced by performance data that couldn't be argued with. Not all the domes succeeded. Some builders cut corners, used inadequate insulation, cheap materials. Some designs were flawed, wrong dimensions, poor ventilation. Dome construction required precision, but properly built domes consistently performed 45 to 60% better than conventional homes. The principle was proven. Between 1973 and 1978, an estimated 200 geodesic domes were built in Vermont alone. The concept spread to New Hampshire, Maine, upstate New York. The energy crisis made efficiency essential. Domes offered a proven solution. Buckminster Fuller's theories, validated in the harshest laboratory possible, Vermont winter. David Brennan was vindicated, but not through argument or mathematics. Through performance. Through keeping his family warm when conventional wisdom froze. Through one night when his neighbor's child found warmth in the structure everyone had mocked. The dome still stands today, 52 years old. David passed away in 2015 at age 81. Ellen still lives, age 88. Their son Thomas owns the property now, raised his 3 children in the same structure. The original wood stove still functions. Heating costs remain 60% below equivalent conventional homes. The mathematics still work. The geometry still wins. On January nights when temperature drops below zero and wind screams down from Canada, that half-century-old dome holds 70 degrees with 4 hours of wood burning per day. Not because of miracle materials or advanced technology. Because a mathematics teacher understood what nature has known for 500 million years. A sphere is the most efficient shape in the universe. And the frontier of efficiency isn't about bigger, it's about smarter. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Have you ever trusted mathematics over conventional wisdom? Hit that subscribe button for one proven alternative building technique every week, and hit the like button if the story changed how you think about heating and geometry, because the wisest solutions often come from the people everyone thought were crazy. Please listen to this educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices, documented geodesic dome construction, and well-established thermodynamic principles. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable building codes. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional architectural, engineering, or construction advice.